Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kofi Annan Foundation and Goodluck Jonathan Foundation dialogue on COVID-19 and the crisis of democratic legitimacy in Africa. My name is Ayisha Osori, and I am the Executive Director for Open Society Initiative for West Africa. We're a grant-making and advocacy organization based in Dakar, and our work covers 10 countries within West Africa. We're also part of the Open Society Foundation network. I welcome you all, our participants. Thank you for joining us on time. Thank you for choosing to be with us for the next hour and a half. I know there's a lot of interesting conversations taking place across the world, so it means a lot to us that you're here with us this afternoon. According to the WHO, Africa remains the least affected region globally, at least for now, by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the numbers are rising quickly. This time last month, about 17th of May, there were about 71,845 Africans infected with COVID-19. As of yesterday, June 11th, that number had more than doubled to over 216,000 Africans infected. Unfortunately, the pandemic comes at a time when many governments face challenges of democratic legitimacy due to unpopular and undemocratic constitutional amendments, such as what we've seen recently in Guinea, doubtful integrity of elections, rising inequality, poor management of resources, lack of public goods, and low trust between citizens and the state. The situation means that African governments are obliged to deal with ensuring the health and safety of communities while having limited resources to do so. This has resulted in the use of force to implement lockdowns that threaten livelihoods, whether it be the postponement of elections or holding elections under unsuitable conditions or restrictions to movement and assembly. The abuse of democratic rights in already fragile democracies may pose just as great a threat to Africa as the pandemic itself. The concern now is whether African governments can be trusted to uphold democratic principles as they maneuver around the emergency created by the pandemic. Citizens must insist that governments use their power legitimately to ensure that democratic rights and the rule of law, as well as socio-economic rights, are preserved. We have gathered 3 outstanding Africans with unique competencies and experience to reflect with us today on how the pandemic and its response is affecting elections and democracy in Africa, and seek their views, insights, and recommendations in handling the pandemic. Thank you for joining us, Your Excellency. Really a pleasure to have you with us today. Today's webinar is part of a series of dialogues that the Goodluck Jonathan Foundation and the Kofi Annan Foundation have been organizing since the pandemic began. It is an attempt to shape the debate despite the limitations posed by meeting physically. This is a public event, and we encourage all our participants, viewers, to interact with the panel by sending your questions either here on the Blue Jeans platform. You will see the links, the icons on the right of your screen, or on the Kofi Annan Foundation and Goodluck Jonathan Foundation Facebook pages, where we are also streaming live. I will put forward some of your questions to the panelists in the second half of this webinar, and I will also encourage you to please participate in the polls that we'll be putting up during the course of the webinar. You can post your views on social media using the hashtags KAFXGJFdialogues. That's hashtag KAFXGJFdialogues, or more generic hashtags for Africa democracy or electoral integrity. And now I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers today. The first is Madam President Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, and the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Second is Dr. Goodluck Jonathan, former president of Nigeria and chair of the Goodluck Jonathan Foundation. And finally, we have with us Elhadj As Sy, who is chair of the Kofi Annan Foundation and co-chair of the Joint World Bank WHO Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. It's a pleasure to be able to host this conversation with you today, Your Excellencies. Thank you for being here. Now I'm going to move on quickly to the very first question, which all three of you will have 5 minutes each to respond to. And I will ask you to speak in the order in which I introduced you. So meaning that Madam President will go first, then Dr. Jonathan, and then Elhadj Sy. So the question is, how is the pandemic evolving in your country? And how is it affecting governance, democracy, and elections there? Madam President, you have the floor.
Cases in Liberia, 410, 206 have been recovered, and we've already had 31 deaths. The government has acted relatively timely, adopting all the protocols that relate to a shutdown. The last of it, the extension, was just a week ago, that actually responded to the impatience of population, particularly those living in crowded communities, for being out of the activities of their livelihood for so long. We have noticed that as a result of that, more activity had started, and there seems to be much more. It's evolving into many more deaths, many more persons to have been confirmed between the period of April and June. Obviously, like most other countries, the major problems have been the lack of testing facilities, the lack of resources in terms of equipment, hospitals, clinics. They have had to use hotels sometimes to be able to take confirmed cases and be able to treat them. A lot of improvisations to ensure that people got attention, and when already confined and isolated, being able to have the medical supplies and equipment required for treatment obviously has provided a problem, has presented major challenges for the government. Resources have indeed been made available through partnership arrangements, such as the World Bank. The International Monetary Fund has provided some budgetary support, the United States and all, and so they also have been able to obtain a certain amount of allocation to address livelihoods, and that means giving sustenance to people, particularly those who are disadvantaged, those who are marginalized in society, many of those who have lost jobs, ensuring that they have the means to do it. Of course, we must realize two things. One, in all those resources, essentially might represent just a reallocation. And that could well mean that other programs that had already been agreed upon and already under implementation might find that they would not be able to reach their target goals if some of this money has been diverted to the program for response to COVID. The other aspect of ensuring proper allocation and use of resources is that the resources could likely be diverted from those who are actually in need, those who really need the support to protect their livelihoods, to others, who hold decision-making positions and who would want to play the role of being the intermediaries for the delivery of support, such as food supplies. Elections, yes, Liberia has a by-election for senatorial seats scheduled for October this year. We've already had indications, not yet formalized and not yet agreed upon through our legislature, that there may be a call for the postponement of this election on the basis of the resources that have had to be diverted from the budgetary allocations from public resources to be able to meet the requirements of fighting the pandemic. Obviously, there may be good reasons for this, but it may also be used as a ploy when a ruling party perhaps is not ready to be able to compete effectively in an election. But as I said, there's no official word on that, but we also have a very vibrant civil society and a very equally vibrant media that are not only involved in discussing all elements of shortcomings and the positive also of how the government is handling this and the implications it would have. I think the biggest challenge will come when the pandemic ends and they have to face the disruption that will be caused by this COVID and by the fact that the functioning of governments have had to be derailed in a way to be able to keep people locked up. Those that we have lost in terms of capacity from trained people who may have left the country to reside elsewhere because of their own fear of this. And what this means, if we may use our own Ebola experience, that the greatest challenge post-Ebola was to ensure that we had the means to be able to get the economy back on track, to be able to put back in place all the institutions that found themselves a bit interrupted and loss of good qualified personnel. In our case, of course, added to that was the question of the last year of my administration was a political year, and that made it even more difficult. We can only two things that we're hoping will claim the attention of the authorities. One is to make sure there's a proper assessment of the impact of COVID-19 so that the information to the public is reliable and that they really know truly, what the cases were, how many were tested, how many died and whatnot. That assessment to make the public, to increase the confidence of the public is very important. And also that they really have a post-COVID plan of action for recovery of the economy and to get back all the governance structures that are required for managing the country. So that's where we are in Liberia. We try to keep track with what's happening in West Africa, particularly our sister country, Sierra Leone, where we have the same kinds of environment. And we also follow ECOWAS and all the ECOWAS dictates and guidance in that. And the AU, I think we are sure that all of those are looked upon as decisions are made and policies are formulated to respond now and after, hopefully, when after the pandemic has eased or has ended in Liberia. So thank you very much. Those are my comments.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Dr. Jonathan, you have the floor now for your 5-minute response.
Thank you so much. Let me first appreciate the Kofi Annan Foundation and my foundation, the Goodluck Jonathan Foundation, for encouraging this dialogue, this conversation, on these very, very sensitive issues. Talk about crisis of democratic legitimacy in Africa. This is key. Legitimacy, that's conformity with the laws or the rules. How can we make sure that African nations, in spite of the COVID-19 effect, keep on to the rules, keep on to the laws governing democratic processes? And African nations are very critical when you talk about COVID-19, because you know that most African countries are very, very fragile. If you look at the recent publication, the May 2020 publication about fragile states, published by the Funds for Peace, where there are 772 countries. And you look at the first 20, only 6 are non-African countries. That's out of the first 20, 14 African countries. The best African country in terms of fragility index, that is the least fragile African country, is Botswana, which is number 116 out of the 172 nations. The second best is Ghana, 107. And you see that the first 50, 90% of the first 50 are African countries. And how many countries do we have in Africa? 53, 54. That means that the whole continent is made up of very fragile states. And when you study human populations, and even animal populations, that the most fragile the population is, the effect of external influence, perturbation, affect them more. That means that the COVID-19, which is a major perturbation on population, will affect Africa continent much more than any other continent in the world. So these conversations are critical. And I will encourage other organizations to continue with this. When it comes to Nigeria, because you specify we should talk about our nations, of course the government is trying, the people are fine. We start from total lockdown when the incident happened. The figures in Nigeria are rising. Presently, we have over 14,000 cases, I think 14,554 cases as of last night. About 4,494 recoveries. Now, about 387 deaths so far. And this is with limited testing. We have just tested about 84,375 people out of the population that is put at about 200 million. So you really see the number tested is quite low. That means that if we're able to test 50% of our population, these figures may be very outrageous. So you see that the COVID-19 effect is significant in Nigeria, just like most other African countries. But the good thing is that from the beginning, we started with total lockdown. But because of the effect on the people and the economy, the government is coming down gradually from total lockdown to a graduated lockdown. Presently, there are some limitations, or there are some openings that are given to people. Before, you can't even do any form of burial, whether the person died from COVID effect or not. Religious houses were closed down completely. Schools closed down completely. But now the emphasis is, of course, the social distancing is there. Then there are some days that markets are open for people to shop. Religious houses are allowed to gather with strict protocol, not more than 20 people, depending on the area covered. Even at the political front, the Independent National Electoral Commission of the country has scheduled elections for 2 states, one of the states called Edo State is scheduled for 19th of September, and Ondo State October 10, with protocols for primaries, and they are working on the protocol for the general election. You know, before this time, there were parliamentary elections that are supposed to be conducted in March, but they were rescheduled because those are not as sensitive as governorship elections and presidential elections. So with the adjustment of protocols, activities are going on. But people are also mindful about the health of it. You cannot adjust the protocols to the extent that you expose the life of your citizens to extreme danger, because the COVID-19 is real and people are dying in Nigeria. So far, these are some good stories, there are some bad stories. In terms of external assistance, there are some organizations that have assisted the country. From the information I have, the European Union have assisted us with 50 million euro in cash. That's about 21 billion naira. The United States government, through the USAID, have assisted us with about 8.5 billion naira. That's $21.4 million. The German donated about 5.5 million euros, about 2.5 billion. These are funds that have come to the country in cash. In terms of loans, the IMF has made a provision for $3.4 billion. That's about 1.3 trillion naira. But that is loan. That means that the government may take or take a part of it. But this is targeted at economic recovery, because COVID economic recovery to help the country get over it. Of course, there were some kind donations from the government of China that donated some ambulances, and also the United Nations made provision for some PPEs, personal protective equipment, from China, personal protective equipment, US ambulances. Actually, this come in kind. It's better. It's easier to manage kind donations than cash donations because of leakages. So as a nation, we're progressing. The good thing is that so many sub-national governments in Nigeria, the states, the governors are very active in terms of managing the COVID-19 crisis, protecting the citizens, and distributing some welfare packages to cushion the effect, especially during periods of complete lockdown or partial lockdown. Some of the states definitely are doing better than others, but all the state governors have keyed in and were impressed by their activities. In terms of the citizens' response to COVID-19, yes, the response is positive and negative. A number of people who are well enlightened agree with the government protocols because you must protect your life. But because of the challenges of feeding, especially those who live based on their daily incomes, if they are locked down, how do they feed with their children? And even if they get the palliative from government, sometimes the palliative may cover certain items. Probably it could give you rice, give you beans, give you yam, but probably they will not give you meat and fish to cook for your children. You may not have oil. You may not have pepper. You may not have salt. So it's difficult for government to give a complete package palliative in the African states, where all what we need, from salt to pepper, also in terms of cooking, gas or kerosene stoves and so on. So these people who are daily workers, who earn their money daily and use that one to feed their families, are still challenged. So their reaction is different from those who have steady source of income and they have some savings, and who are living in the bigger houses where they have the capacity to store food. They have deep freezers, regular freezers and stores. But people living in high density areas don't have these facilities. We still have problems with power, even if you have deep freezers. So the response is positive, negative. Some people could even tell you that I prefer to die from COVID than to die from hunger. That is a reaction from extreme frustration. But generally, the atmosphere is not so bad. And I can say both the federal government and the sub-national government, the state governments, are working hard and they are trying. I believe Africa will get out of this COVID-19 incident. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, Dr. Jonathan. Elhadj As Sy, the floor is yours now for your response.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayisha. And the Kofi Annan Foundation is very honored to be alongside President Johnson-Sirleaf and President Goodluck Jonathan to reflect on this very important issue of our time. Thank you, Excellencies, for honoring us to reflect together on this. We at the Foundation, we recognize very, very early on that this shock and hazard of the kind of COVID-19 is not only a health issue, but it is an issue of a multidimensional nature, of a multi-sectoral nature that would definitely, call for a deep understanding of all its ramifications on the one hand, but beyond the understanding also to promote a multidimensional and multi-sectoral response, that will be touching on so many aspects, of people's lives. So what started as a health shock at the global level is also a revealer. It's a revealer of many dysfunctionalities that we have in our systems, in many countries in the world. It is a revealer also of dysfunctionalities, at the global level. What we have seen very early on was that, supply chain was broken, borders, were closed, people were getting into themselves, focusing, within their national interest and national borders, forgetting at the same time that it is a pandemic. And in a pandemic, really none of us is safe until we all are. In a pandemic, we are as strong as our weakest link in that sense. So the kind of a global platform of solidarity that is needed, to share knowledge, to share experience, and to share resources, to respond, effectively. We realized very early on the Foundation it was missing, and that is the reason why we're advocating for that. It is a revealer also and a test at a national level. It is a test of governance. It is a test of leadership. It is also a test of trust, between government and, the public. It is a test of the health systems that are weak and in some places that are quasi-inexistent. It is also the test of the gaps and disparities, that we see between the formal and informal sectors that are running in parallel in many of our countries. So what we've learned, definitely is the fact that, where you had a certain level of good governance and a leadership that will be acting on early, will provide a basis, for a good response. And President Johnson-Sirleaf, mentioned the experience gathered in Liberia, during the Ebola response, that provided a kind of a platform upon which one could build. And that is very important because it's very difficult in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a pandemic, to start from scratch, to build trust, to start from scratch, to develop an appropriate response, to that. We could say the same, about Nigeria as well, that early on, the response, to the Ebola outbreak that shielded, the country with a large population that was not as affected as we have seen in many other parts of the region, and leading later on to the establishment of the African CDC, which is a kind of an early alert and early warning mechanism that will be guiding the states and governments, to take, the appropriate measures. But the shock of this magnitude will pretty much, go well beyond the capacity of any single country alone, and particularly, particularly the developing countries. But we have seen, there is that what we communicate as a public health emergency, we always should remind ourselves that it does not equate automatically to a state of emergency. It will communicate a sense of urgency for sure. It communicates, a sense of speed, of early action, early response. But the speed, should be balanced with a certain level of accountability so that it does not undermine either, the principles, of freedoms, of people. It does not, undermine also the exercise of citizenship, of people. It does not undermine also the legal framework within which one has been operating and the respect of the different milestones in those legal frameworks and the democratic systems and mechanisms, that have to be respected. Some changes, may happen because of the shock, for sure, because of its magnitude, for sure. But even in those circumstances, there is a need for engagement with the public. There is a need for dialogue. There is a need, to create an enabling and safe environment where people can participate in order to better understand, what is expected from them and be supported, to embrace the measures that are being taken as well as, the processes that have been proposed to them. And to be able to afford that is also very critical. And that's the reason why we always refer to the formal and the informal systems and within which, people will have almost on a daily basis, try to develop their own strategies of survival are not always in adequation with the public health measures, that can be imposed by the formal system, leading to a longer term lockdown, leading to a number of measures, that simply people will not be able to afford. And we have heard it a number of times from the public. Should I die from COVID or die from hunger? Can we, continue to just, struggle and then get some information from the top? And that is also testing the kind of a trust, that we are seeing. Now, I think what we're trying, all of us together, is to see how can we together have a more complex and a deeper understanding of what we are facing here. How can we build on, some of the gains that have been made through previous shocks and hazards such as Ebola? What lessons can we learn, from good leadership? And I'm very happy to have good leaders joining us to share their experience. What can we also better understand in terms of community engagement and accountability and community participation, to move along, decision makers, in that spirit. If we do so, then the social cohesion that we would like to see happen will be strengthened. If we do so, the networks of solidarity at the community and national level would be strengthened. So if we do so, then there will be a credibility of a national leadership and a response to also contributing to shaping the global response. And that is very critical. So I heard about a lot of contributions, that richer countries have made in supporting, the response in Africa. I heard, and I'm aware of, the kind of mechanisms that were put in place by the IMF and the World Bank, for the benefit of the African countries. But in a situation of a pandemic, then we need what we call global goods. And those global goods, should be accessible to everybody. And unless, leadership will exercise also its right to shape, the global agenda, we will get into some kind of a nationalism in terms of masks, nationalisms in terms of PPEs, nationalism in terms of vaccines that are not yet available, but already some bilateral deals are being made, so that those who can afford will be served first, and then those who are not that rich will be served last. And that will not be effective in fighting, any pandemic. I think democracy, the way we look at it, is to create an enabling environment, where we will be credible vis-a-vis people, will be relevant vis-a-vis people, and that relevance, will mean that people are carried along the same path of understanding, of engagement, of respect, of the legality, legal frameworks that are existing, and if drastic measures have to be taken, they have to be taken, in a certain level of proportionality that will take into account the socio-economic conditions, of the people. And that is in that spirit that the Kofi Annan Foundation is very honored to partner with the Dr. Goodluck Jonathan Foundation and then other leaders, such as President Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and others, to continue to cultivate and nurture that spirit that will be, at the end of the day, contributing to what we all care about, which is the dignity of human beings, and that will be contributing to our common goal, which is peace and non-violence, for resilient societies that we would like to see happen. Thank you very much, Nobel.
Thank you very much for your responses, Madam President, Mr. President Elhadj Sy. Just to recap for the benefit of the participants who joined us while you were in the middle, our three speakers were speaking to the question, how is the pandemic evolving in your country? How is it affecting governance, democracy, and elections there? And we got some really good responses with Madam President sharing with us how the Ebola experience have helped Liberians to deal with this and to prepare for what they know will be a shock to the economy post the pandemic, while President Jonathan, in addition to other things he said, also talked about how the Electoral Commission and the parties are working on protocols to guide the primaries and the gubernatorial elections that are going to happen in Nigeria before the end of the year, while we heard from Elhadj Sy about the need for collaboration, the need for the leadership on the continent that will ensure that we Africans are also shaping the global agenda, and we're going to be able to frame how public goods are going to be developed and distributed. Now, for the next stage, we are going to have a poll. Are the polls ready? The poll is, how has your government, so this is a poll for now we have over 100 attendees, and that's fantastic. We are going to ask you to answer this question. Has your government managed the pandemic emergency measures such as restrictions on movement, lockdowns, and curfews? And you have several options there to choose from. One is, has the government used excessive force? Were there civilian casualties? 2, whether there was limited force and no civilian casualties. 3, lockdowns and curfews were calm and there were no security incidents, which would be great. And 4, there were no restrictions on movement in my country. So please respond. We're seeing already that the majority, the majority is over 50%, over 63% are saying that the government is, it's dropping, it's changing. But for now, we're seeing that, there were no restrictions on movement in my country at the lowest. Obviously, so most countries had restrictions. Only 4% of us say there were none. Lockdowns and curfews were calm and peaceful with no security incidents. That's about 20% of us. Government used limited force and there were no civilian casualties. That's about a quarter of the attendees. The number is still changing. And over 50% of us are saying that, unfortunately, there was excessive force and violence, which we heard about in the news, and there were civilian casualties. So thank you for that. Before the end of this webinar, we will discuss a little bit what the implications of the results of these polls that we're taking will be. But now I'll move on swiftly to the next question, which will go to Dr. Goodluck Jonathan. And if the speakers want to come in after he has answered this question, then they will have the opportunity to do so. So, Mr. President, the question is, there are many elections coming up in Africa in the coming months. What considerations governments make to ensure that citizens are convinced that strict emergency measures are intended to protect them and not to harm them? And you have 5 minutes for your response.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a direct question. Having been in government for quite some time, I think one can share some experiences. Because the key thing about government policies is no matter how good the policies are, if you don't get the buy-in of the citizen, then you will have some issues. And especially in a democratic setting where you have what is called opposition parties, and in most cases in Africa, we take politics as a war, as if no matter what the sitting government is doing, the opposition must bring it down. In that case, for you to make sure that citizens key in with you based on what you as leaders of the government believe is right and is good for them, their involvement is quite critical. I remember when I was in office, when we had the Ebola incident, without the involvement of the citizens, religious leaders and traditional rulers, we wouldn't have succeeded. But we succeeded because we involved the people. I believe that government must be extremely transparent in such cases. Elections are coming. The lockdown may still be operational. You are not going to expose your citizens to danger. The first line of action is the advocacy that most governments are doing well. In Nigeria, the advocacy is going on quite well. But I believe that across the continent, the messaging process, maybe the clear message may be the same, but conveying this to the people must be a bit dynamic. If you ask only Goodluck Jonathan to be talking every day, who get used to seeing Goodluck Jonathan's face and hearing Goodluck Jonathan's voice? So when Goodluck Jonathan talks, they may no longer bother because they think they have heard enough. But if the next day another person appears, and especially if you use people that society, especially the younger generation, look at them as role models, either people in the sporting industry that are doing well, people in the creative industry, entertainment industry that young people look up to, as well as mere politicians also, and some non-business men and women that have credibility and traditional rulers. If there is a mixture using all these people to convey the same information in different ways to society, the buy-in will be more. And people will now believe that these programs of government, the protocols of government, are more positive to them. Their intention is to protect them than to punish them. But no matter what government does, as long as there's a lockdown, you must feel some pains. Even those who have everything in their homes, limiting them into their houses is almost like a house arrest. That don't go out frequently to visit your good friends and so on. It's like somebody in a house arrest. So even those who have everything in their homes, in their big compounds, I feel pains. Basically, they must be convinced that this protocol by government is meant to help them. And the only way you can do that, and the proper way to do that, is to involve the people. Involve the private sector, involve the sporting industry. I remember in Nigeria now, there are some number of organizations participating in communicating to society. I've watched people in the television houses and radio houses coming up with a team of telecasters and broadcasters that people love to send the message. I've watched one produced by this Association of Female Golfers. The president, secretary, and other golfers, they are ladies, sending these messages out. I've watched that from the footballers and others. So this creates better impact than just listening to the ministers or commissioners of health or the directors general of the Centers for Disease Control. They are professional technical people. But if you listen to them too frequently, you get bored. So what government must do is involve civil society, involve role models in society, to communicate to people, respect traditional rulers and religious leaders. And religious leaders are key. I remember during the Ebola crisis, there are two major steps I took that helped to save the country. Immediately, the first index case landed in Nigeria was in the US. I flew back that night. And the minute I got to the airport, I moved straight to my office and called emergency meeting of technical people in government, the relevant ministers, health, finance, water resources, attorney general, and so on. And we look at it from purely technical aspect and took certain decisions. And I gave a broadcast that evening immediately. The second day of my arrival, I met with all the sub-national government heads, all the governors of the 36 states, and asked them to come with their commissioners for health, because I want the whole country to move in one direction. I presided over that meeting with my vice president, my health minister, attorney general, finance minister. So every state gave us their perspective, and we all discussed the best way for us to manage the Ebola, and where the federal government can assist, and where the state should be able to do. After that, we encouraged the religious groups to meet. The Sultan of Sokoto and the Archbishop Onaiko from the Christians. They organized religious leaders, both Muslims, and I addressed them. So we didn't have this kind of discordant tones from religious leaders. Because if you don't carry religious leaders along, you will never succeed. Because religion is based on faith. Whether the religious leader is saying the wrong thing or the right thing, the belief of any follower is that the religious leaders represent God on earth. And God does not make mistakes. So they don't see their religious leaders making mistakes. So even if the religious leader is dead and is a product of COVID impact, in fact, religious leaders will still want to trust that way. That is how religion is. So you must manage their sentiments.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your answer. I'm just trying to make sure that we manage time and we can get as many voices in as possible. So it's time for the next poll, which is, do you trust state authorities in your country to uphold the rule of law during the pandemic? This is a much easier one to answer. It's just yes or no or unsure. So there are three options: yes, no, or unsure. I hope the poll is up. Trying to find the results. Yes, no. Wow. Okay. Almost 100%. Oh, wow. Okay. Results are still coming in. And yes and no are the active answers. While that comes in, we're seeing that most of the people are answering 69% fluctuating are saying no, we don't trust. So yes, this comes to what we talked about earlier about the crisis of legitimacy in Africa, which is one of the factors or one of the symptoms of that is low trust between the state and the government. But we'll move on quickly to the next question. And as I said, we'll talk about the results of the poll before the end of the webinar. This question is for Madam President. Madam President, the question is, how can a government concretely build broad political and public support during the pandemic? Please, if you would keep your answer down to maybe 2 to 3 minutes, that would be great. How can a government concretely build broad political and public support during the pandemic? The floor is yours, Madam President.
I'd like to use the Ebola experience just to say, because we didn't know about this virus when it hit us, I think we were subject at many points with doubts and lack of confidence. because this was a strange disease that nobody knew, and the means to address them also not known. And even though we had a similar one in the Democratic Republic in the Congo many years ago, no attention was given to this until it hit 3, 4 fragile West African countries. All right, the first thing is to engage all of the leaders with the knowledge of the pandemic, its effect, types of responses that are necessary. In other words, organize full sessions of information sharing with large segments of the population. Make sure that there's regular and timely reporting on the impact of the virus so that the public are well aware. Ensuring that a coordinating mechanism with authorities, particularly health authorities, who have the knowledge to be able to inform those on the line of being able to address the pandemic, and with the knowledge to do so, making sure that that coordination with regular knowledge dissemination, knowledge accumulation, so that everyone involved knew exactly what the impact was, what additional measures need to be taken if decisions required some changes from time to time. Making sure that you engage religious, because Liberia is, again, very Christianized country, and so getting our leaders who are preaching on Sundays to make sure they talk about this and inform the public on what's going on, the media, so that they have full information to be able to report very carefully, doing some music and songs and jingles and all of that to get this. And let me say that one important thing is there will always be missteps, particularly if you're facing something that is unknown and for which you have no experience. And even though you may get a kind of support from international organizations, from the World Health Organization, from your own health authorities, Koto may have some missteps. And we had major missteps by using a militant approach in the beginning. The important thing, because we did face a confidence problem, but what you did was to recognize that we were wrong, admit that we were wrong to the public, this approach doesn't work, change it, and that's time, gave back the whole responsibility for addressing the virus to the public themselves, to the leadership in communities, giving them the support, the training, the knowledge, while putting them in charge, so that they could use all the cultural and traditional methods for which they were accustomed to be able to do that. In all of this, I will leave with one closing line. Leadership by example was the key. Political leadership, technical leadership, community leadership. And for that, it meant leadership by example. Getting directly involved, going into the communities yourself, sharing that knowledge, carrying supplies to them, helping them to address and overcome their fears, making hard decisions when necessary, even if it meant that this will affect your popularity. So while we had a confidence problem, with all these measures put in place, I think not only did we beat the prediction of what the number of deaths that we would have to experience, but also in the end, we had a public that realized what all it took and how much we tried. And I think we broke the confidence factor, and we got all communities involved. And when we close, at a level of deaths much, much shorter than anyone expected, I believe those measures that we took over time proved to be effective. And because some of these measures are being used today with COVID-19, the example of Ebola have now passed to our authorities in COVID-19. I think that's why they too are able to have a public that is going along, trying to be compliant, although they do get tired and sometimes they begin to resist. But by and large, I think it was a public that appreciated what they went through with Ebola, what they experienced, how their government handled it. And today, I think the country is made better off to be able to fight the current pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, for your answer. Now, the next question will go back. Before I ask the next question, which is going to Mr. President again, I'd like to remind the audience to please send your questions. We have received quite a number. Thank you. We will start answering those questions in another 15 minutes or so. So keep sending them. And we've seen the ones that you have already sent in. Thank you for those. Mr. President, with so much external funding coming into African countries for the pandemic response, and you, in your earlier response, you mentioned how much had come to Nigeria, for example. How can governments ensure transparency and accountability to their citizens and strengthen the social contract of governments and states?
Thank you so much. When external funding comes into government for the people, including internal funding, because there are some countries where some strong private sector people donate some money. In Nigeria too, the central bank coordinated some top business people like Dangote, Aliko Dangote, and others that have made some funds available. To get the confidence of the people, you must separate these funds from government funds. If you simply pay these funds to your treasury and being disbursed through the bureaucracy of government and management of funds by government, you may do the right thing, but the public will not accept and they will not agree. I had experience when I was in office. In 2012, we had a major flood. Of course, you know about the flood of 2012. People who are less than 100 years never seen that level of flood. It was the height. And Nigeria was highly impacted by that 2012 flood. Government had some funds, we intervened, but we felt that we need donations from well-meaning individuals to make sure that they cushion the effect of this flooding and probably have reserve funds to manage some natural disaster. What I did was to set up a committee headed by Aliko Dangote, who is one of our best business people. We don't expect Aliko Dangote to go and mismanage 10 billion belonging to them. Then we had a successful businessman, a lawyer, who is also a member of civil society, to be his deputy chair. And we have credible Nigerians, people know that they are credible, members of that committee. Of course, the Ministry of Finance was represented because government must know what was happening. But the authority to release that fund was in the hands of Aliko Dangote, and those key members. And it encouraged people to donate because they knew that it's not the government under Jonathan that was going to manage that fund directly. When we have some major effects in northeast of our country, where some soldiers and police died in the process, managing their families was a problem. So many people were impacted by terrorist activities. And I believe government funding alone we may not be able to meet up. And I wanted to encourage private people within and outside the country. We call them the Victim Support Fund, so that every security person involved, and there's some impact, that even probably requires flying abroad or management of his family, we could get funds from there We set up that victim support fund, and we brought General T.Y. Danjuma, who Nigerians know his commitment. He has a foundation on his own. He spends millions of dollars every year for the common people. We don't expect T.Y. Danjuma to go and mismanage that, embezzle 5 billion belonging to them. And we have people in civil society, credible young men and women, they are still there. In both funds, as I'm talking today, we have billions of naira still in those funds. People have confidence, and that's why people participated, people donated. And up to this time that I left office, nobody has raised any issue about mismanagement of any money, either for the Victim Support Fund or the National Disaster Funds that were created, because of the involvement of the people and the credible people. If government alone had managed that money, by now you would have had so many stories of even investigations being done. Somebody mismanaged 1 billion or 2 million or whatever. So I think the key thing to answer the question directly is that monies, external monies that come in for intervention for specific purposes, government alone not manage. But involve credible people from the public, members of civil society, religious leaders that have respect, and others that the people believe in. That as a president, a prime minister, you can go and sleep. And you will be convinced that the right thing will be done for you. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for that answer, Mr. President. Madam President, do you have any remarks to make to this President Jonathan's answer or to the question itself?
As I try to gather the information on the external funding for Liberia during this pandemic, I had some difficulties making sure that I had it all from all sources. And so I would say that I'll have to say to our government that they need to do both. If I'm unable to get all the sources and say comprehensively, these are the funding made available, from the sources for the purposes. If I am having some difficulty, I think the person down there in the community at the community level must also be having, and that would lead to misinformation, on perhaps unjustified criticism and accusations and all of that. So I would say to them, do that. But fortunately, there's a silver lining in the Liberia case. They appointed a woman who's our former mayor and the Director General of General Services Agency, and they put all the funding, for able to respond to those who are to those who require subsistence and sustenance. She's put in charge of that, and I think she's well known for being a tough one in what she does and how she manages things and her integrity. So I rely on that silver lining that her own experience and her own results of her own management will spread, and people will get to know the full story.
Thank you very much for that, Madam President. Elhadj As Sy, would you like to say a few words on this question as well, or in response to the answers of Their Excellencies?
Yeah, thank you. Am I muted?
We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I fully agree with the Excellencies in what I've said. But if I look at, we talk about the flow of funding that went to Africa for this COVID-19 response, and of course the numbers seems to be huge, but let's be realistic, they do not match the scale and the magnitude of the problem that we are facing. In terms of the needs in the health sector, the needs, at the community level, and all the measures, that should accompany the response, for people to preserve their livelihood and dignity in order to adopt and then keep the public health measures. So the funding is far from enough. it is not enough from government sources. I think more has to be done. It is not enough from the private sector in our countries that could do, much more and then should do more. So normal individual ordinary citizens are even contributing, and I think it's the duty of everybody to contribute, to that, and of course to be matched now with the resources that are coming from international institutions like the ones we mentioned, before, as part of the global solidarity, that we need to promote in such situations. So when those funds, are available, of course, it is a test for transparency. It is a test, for trust, among the people. And here, it is very important that governments, concentrate to do what they do best. That means create an enabling environment. That means, putting systems in place where resources can be managed and then channeled to where they should be spent. That means incentivizing the supply chain so that there is no stock out. That means also incentivizing the economy, so that people can go and then procure and then have a market and the resources put, in the hands, of the citizens, in order to get access to the commodities, that they need. So there is some kind of a traditional practices that government tend to take, which in this day and age, I think are not probably the most appropriate ones. So governments going around the world and buying rice and buying pasta and then renting lorries to go to distribute in this place and that other one. And along the chain, there will be so many things, lost, and then so many doubts, about the transparency and so on. I think if the economy is incentivized and the supply chain preserved and people given cash, then they will have their dignity preserved and then choose at this particular time what they need most. And that choice, it really is a dignifying thing, that it is much better than what we're seeing now more and more, to have old women and men lining up, 40 degrees in the shade, for hours to carry back home a bag of rice that they can hardly, put on their head. And, all these the suspicion along the chain that things were not transparent, it was not being done, and people who were, not the most needy are accessing on it. I think, there is time that I think in these kind of systems be put in place, and that government can do much better than anybody else. If it is coming now to, supply chain and procurement, management, and, giving people the choice to preserve their dignity, to access, what they want. And I think some of the examples that I'm hearing, like, putting in place a separate, management structure, to do that in an appropriate way, I think, that is something that we can build on and learn more of and maybe take at a larger scale.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And actually, the next question is for you. And from after this question, then I'm going to go to the platform to take questions from the participants and the audience. We have gotten lots of questions from Blue Jeans, but if there's anybody on Facebook who wants to ask any questions, please do so. Elhadj Sy, the question for you is, what can Africans, including regional organizations, do to shore up the democratic gains in Africa, considering the regression of democracy around the world? And I know that you've spoken to this, so if you would maybe keep your answers brief so that we have enough time to engage our participants.
Well, we talk about demographic gains, and I'm glad to hear gains. That means that progress have been made and then gains have been made. And I think the challenge and opportunities here is to preserve, those gains. And one way to preserve those gains is consistency. To be consistent, in the commitments that are being made, to also deliver on promises that are being made to people. If we do not deliver on the promises, there will not be trust. If there is no trust, then we will not be engaging people on the same path. So to preserve, in a consistent way, that space that is safe, for people to express themselves, and then the trust that they feel that their voice counts, that discard, that they use to vote counts, that the expectations, that they have, from governments and leaders, will be fulfilled and encountered. And that measures that are being taken to respond to their needs are the measures, that are appropriate and then give the kind of a legitimacy as well as the credibility, that is required. So many gains, made in that area, in like we're talking about COVID in the area of health. Is it enough? Probably not. Have we made progress? Definitely yes. The question is, how do we build on that and then take it to scale, rather than other levels? And then the more we advance to that, the more trust will be won, more participation will be there, and more credibility will be there. And I think, that's really what we have to continue to work on. And there are some milestones, that also have to always to be regarded in that. So elections are important, their transparency are important, and their frequency and the timing, that has to be respected, and that we do not use shocks and hazards as an alibi to undermine those processes. That is something that is also very critical that we need to, keep an eye on. So transparency in all that across the board is really key. And the Kofi Annan Foundation is putting a particular importance to that, engaging with civil society organizations, with regional institutions, as well as with government. And for example, one of the flagship programs that late Kofi Annan is promoting and that we continue to work on is, the component of digital and digitalization in election, to even further contribute, to transparency and its modernization. These are some steps, that can contribute into preserving democratic gains, but it's a journey that we need to continue to travel. Every stepping stone will lead to another one, and I think that is only to continue to travel that path that we will be, nurturing, permanently nurturing, the democracy on our continent.
Thank you so much for that response, Elhadj Sy, and for keeping it short. And so because this is such an important question, I'm going to ask the same question of President Jonathan and Madam President Sirleaf. But I'll make it a bit harder. If you had a magic wand, President Jonathan, and you could do only one thing, what would you do to protect our democracy in Africa? The one thing you think is most important to do?
The single thing I will do is make sure that all the countries key in to electronic voting. As long as we are allowed to manipulate our electoral processes, we can never talk about strengthening democracy, because there's always the temptation to manipulate the process. So whatever you will do, make sure that the votes count. What in my days, I say one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, one youth, one vote. As long as the votes count, then of course we can talk about
democracy. That's extremely powerful, and you're right. We need just that transparency, one person, one vote. Madam President, are you there with us?
But I think I'm muted. I don't know why.
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
I don't know what to. Let me see if I can.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Okay. All right. Well, as I was saying, I said, in these current times of complexities and uncertainties, democracy is at risk because there are the global leadership is not demonstrating from all places their commitment to the policy of choice, to be able to ensure that marginalized are given the opportunity to achieve their goals. And I just fear that all the gains we have, we maintaining the gains, I think, just as President Jonathan said, is what we have to ensure. every nation and all our regional institutions have to keep ensuring that those gains are there, because the risk is that some of those will use the examples of global leadership that have departed from all of those policies and international standards and see this as a license to follow those paths and to see it justified by the fact that the bigger ones have now subscribed to a different dogma. But I think we all need to continue through our regional institutions and our civil society organizations and our young people who are demanding that they take their rightful place in the body politic, in what happens in the country and how they're able to choose their leaders and to hold their leaders accountable. But those risks are there. We all must continue to combat them.
Thank you so much for that,
Thank you.
President. And now we're going to move to I think what's going to be my most difficult task with moderating, which I thought it would be managing your time, but it seems that the hardest task will be choosing the questions, because we have so much interest here, Your Excellencies and Mr. C, Elhadj C. If you know the kind of questions that people are asking, I want to pick the ones that are sort of more popular. And I think I'll ask 3 questions at a time so that you can choose which ones you want to answer as briefly as possible. So there's a question that goes to everyone. I think it's very important. So it means anyone can answer. And the question is, the increase in gender-based violence has also been visible, what the Guterres is calling a shadow pandemic. Women have called for a state of emergency in Nigeria and Sierra Leone and other countries. What must governments do to address these violations during COVID-19 and beyond? So that's one question. The other question that's very popular is specifically for President Goodluck Jonathan. It comes from Omowumi Asubiaru Dada. And the question, which is popular, is what are your views about the increase in number of extrajudicial killings and gross human rights violations during the lockdown? And will you consider making a public statement on this to advise the Nigerian government? So that question is specifically for Goodluck Jonathan. And then Elhadj C, you also have a popular question from Haita Sila, which is, it is becoming clear that the fight against COVID-19 in Africa is first and foremost a community fight. Having worked in the fight against HIV/AIDS in Senegal, that's the person is asking, are there any lessons that can be learned from the community strategies that were used? Can we adopt any for COVID-19 pandemic? So those are the first 3 questions. Let's see how quickly. I would advise you to keep it short so that we can get a few more questions in before we have to. So I would like to start with, obviously I'm biased, but Madam President, could you go first, please? Which question? Do you want to answer the question of gender-based violence?
Yes, I think so. I think that's more appropriate for me. I think we need a much more examination of the laws in countries regarding the protection of women. Some countries have them, others don't. Those that do need revisions to ensure that and that they are being implemented. But we need a civil society to continue to press their representatives, to continue to expose our judicial system. If the rule of law is not applied in such a way that those who have violated women can be brought to justice. And so we need to have to strengthen those institutions like the media, like civil society organizations, like women organizations, to enable them to continue to be the strong policeman, continue to be the conscience of everybody in making sure that we do that. I also believe that we need to have more women in decision-making positions in the police, inner security, in places where laws are made. We need to strengthen. Some of our countries are doing well. Others in West Africa are not doing as well. Well, one or two are. But there's a lot of room for all of us to push harder to get women there, simply because women are going to be more protective, of ensuring that the right laws, the right policies are passed and are implemented to protect women, to ensure that women are able to gain their own goals in their life without being shortchanged by those who would prey upon them and subject them to harm. So,
thank you for that, Madam President. Elhadj Sy, do you want to answer your question before I go to Mr. President?
Yes, thank you, Ayisha, and thank you, Haita, for that very important question. Epidemics start in communities, and if they end, they will have to end in communities. That is so clear. And all the epidemics and pandemics that we have gone through and the one in the future will demonstrate the same. It's about individual behavior. It's about attitudinal change, that is needed at the level of families and the level of the communities. Mind you, how complex and difficult and serious COVID-19 is, what are we asking people to do? Wash your hands. Where do we do that? What are we asking people to do? Keep physical distancing while at the same time being socially connected. Where will that happen? All of this will be happening at the community level. As soon as it is about changing behaviors, changing attitudes, and putting together networks of solidarities, for a change to happen at the societal level, that will be happening in the communities. Now, to engage them, I think a lot has been said about community engagement and accountability, which is important. It is about also creating the safe place and environment where communities can participate. It's about to make their voices be heard, and not only be heard, but taken into account in the design and implementation of the policies. So President Sirleaf talked about tough decisions that have to be taken. And if tough decisions have to be taken, their success will be depending in most instances, on how communities will be abiding to those and espousing them in their implementation. In many of our countries, the toughest decisions were, in the eyes of the communities, was the lockdown. You don't go out, stay home, while people will have to go in and struggle for life. Don't go to your places of worship. Mosques closed, churches closed. But maybe it is the right thing to do. But maybe it would be easier to be done if the community leaders themselves, were involved and heard, so that they are part of that decision and communicate the decisions to that communities and explain in a way that is more acceptable. If it is seen as a top-down, decision, on the heads of the communities, it will not work. So that we had, when we were dealing with difficult issues such as sex, protection, blood, in the time of HIV/AIDS, when we were dealing with difficult issues such as safe and dignified burials in time of Ebola, where communities have to be convinced to entrust their loved ones to somebody else to wash and to bury, and to do that in the respect of their culture and their religion. And all of that can only happen, when the communities are embraced and the real relays in those communities and their leaders, have been involved in the decision making and the program implementation. I think there are so many lessons that we can build on. We did some of it, in COVID-19 in many countries, but I don't think enough of it. I think we can do much more and continue to preserve our gains as far as community engagement and accountability are concerned.
Thank you. President Jonathan, would you like to take a few minutes or a minute, if possible, to answer your question so we can ask maybe one or two more before we close?
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe I use half a minute. There are two issues you refer to me. First, my views on extrajudicial killings. Means people that, instead of being arrested and taken to court to adjudicate, security operatives just gun them down. which is not acceptable in any decent society. A person asked whether I want to make a public statement on that. It's very, very sensitive as a former president, but be mindful about public statement. But since I've been reminded, that means that people are calling me involved. I can use the platform of my foundation to work with other civil society organizations to see if you can instigate some kind of dialogue across the country that laws must be obeyed. And most of these extrajudicial killings has to do with managing COVID-19 at the state levels and the excesses of some of our security operatives. That is noted even in Nigeria, and I believe it's noted in other African countries too. The issue of increase in gender-based violence and what we think government can do also is mainly offenses committed at the state levels are based on our laws that are mainly controlled by the state laws. But the key thing is advocacy. And every person, the religious organizations must be involved. Traditional institutions must be involved. It has to do with human behavior, our value system. Of course, government must strengthen the judicial processes. Because if you do proper analysis, if you take rape, for example, some of these who are involved in rape are serial rapists. They will rape one young lady, they will be taken to court, they will get away with it. They are encouraged to do more and more. And you see one particular young person being arrested and even charged to court for 4 or 5 times on rape cases. But the law is yet to hold him down. So we must strengthen our judicial processes. Security operatives too. But all has to do with the general security challenges we have as in our nation. I mentioned earlier how fragile the African states are. When you have general insecurity in any country, the fallout is most of this violence. Gender-based violence where a husband manhandle the wife also has to do with our traditional institutions and human behavior, but maybe because of the lockdown. And that is something cultural. And relatives or friends should be able to manage us. Not everything that government, but the government must set the laws. So if you commit such offense, you must be punished. In African society, we find it very difficult to manage us, the men, no matter how you handle their wives and children. In the developed societies, even their child can call the police to arrest you. Here, the wife finds it difficult to even talk about rape. Africa, they don't even believe that wives could be raped based on their own way of thinking. But based on the English common laws, it cannot be well. So these are something has to do with society and has to do with a daily conversation. And I believe civil society, foundations, media will work together to continue to educate the public on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, we still have so many questions, but I really need to ask the permission of the speakers because I'm mindful of your schedules. Do we have time for one more round? Just a quick one, maybe just another 3, and I will make sure that they're targeted to each of you, and then we can close. But I need to ask your permission first because we have sort of run out of time, but I understand we can do a few minutes extra.
Maybe one minute.
Okay, great. So I'll start with you, President Jonathan. We have a few questions. A few people have asked this question, more than one, and so it makes it difficult to ask their names. Ekwonu Chinelo and I think Hannah Davis have asked questions about education. They're concerned about the education of children during the pandemic. What measures should be put in place and who is supposed to be implementing the strategy and the policies on education, because many people are worried about the disruption that COVID-19 has done. Will we be able to go back to stability in the education sector? So that question is for you. Just hold on so that I can give the other questions to the other speakers. The question for you, Madam President, is from Akwasi. Let me make sure. Yes, Akwasi Sapong from Ghana, who runs the Leaf Foundation, a youth foundation. And the question is, kindly share your thoughts on how youth-adult partnerships can help to reduce the use of youth in extreme violence associated with elections in communities. This is a very important question. So how do we get youth young adults to stop being used for violent elections? And then for you, Elhadj Sy, there's a question on civil society that I'm trying to find. Yes, the question is from Charles Van Dyke, and his question is for you. It says, there has been a call by civil society in the region for ECOWAS to present a clear COVID-19 response and post-pandemic recovery plans to civil society organizations for immediate engagement. What are your thoughts about this request? So I'll start with you, President Jonathan, and then move to Madam President before Elhadj Sy closes.
Thank you so much. I think one key area that the COVID-19 has impacted significantly is the educational sector. Even in the most developed societies. Of course, the education, to take education generally, you classify it into pre-college education. That's from nursery, primary, secondary education, as we call it in Nigeria. Then the post-primary, that is the college education, where you attend a formal tertiary institution, the University of Polytechnic and College of Education for degrees and higher degrees. The COVID has a major impact. Generally, people will say, yes, there should be online learning these days. The private schools, especially private schools in the cities, where parents of the children are fairly okay, have these facilities, they have their laptops, they have their iPads, they have their smartphones, and the schools too have the facilities to teach them online. So online processes are going on. For the public schools, especially public schools, even in the high density areas and the rural areas, they don't have these facilities for online teaching. So those children are just trapped. So even the children that are exposed in private schools that have, the education of a child is not about just reading and writing. It's more than that. The co-curricular activities are completely wiped out. Sporting activities, other forms, singing and others, that really bring up a child to behave in a proper way in society is common. Yes, they can do online and pass exams, but especially at the pre-university or pre-college level of education, that should not be more than 60% of what a child should be. And that aspect is completely impacted. It's almost like a war situation. I remember during the Nigerian Civil War, we were in schools, we were in primary school. So what is happening now in African countries, almost like a civil war. So it's highly impacted. So both the national government and the sub-national government, like in Nigeria, our states, have to play some key role. I believe we'll recover it, but the impact will be quite significant. And I believe this will also help us to review the guidelines for establishing schools, so that we can build a number of regulations, even for public schools and private schools. Because when I worked in the Ministry of Education briefly after my first degree, even for the government-owned schools, for us to establish a new secondary school, we have guidelines, and government must meet up those criteria. Otherwise, we, even a section of the Ministry of Education, would not allow even the very state government to establish a school that does not meet up the minimum standard. So after this COVID experience, both state governments or regional, provincial, and national governments will come up with clear criteria for establishment of both tertiary institutions and lower pre-college institutions to meet up the minimum standard. I believe it will help us. Now it's negative, but it will help us to build a better society in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President?
Well, the most important thing is to expand education and job opportunities for youth. But one needs to go beyond that also and be able to engage them in those activities in which they have interest and which they have expressions, in which they protest. I recall when, people from the students in our universities were rioting every other day over one issue or another that they were dissatisfied with. But the answer to that was to go and sit with them and discuss with them and understand what their issues were. Try to respond and being truthful to them. If some of their desires and their requirements and their demands, could or could not be met. So I think engagement with them at the community level, at the institutional level, supporting the youth organizations, giving them, today we're talking about them have the opportunity, for being able to, for doing things through the computers, all of them now, the access, Twitter, and all the different technological things that they're interesting, and many of them are such good innovators. Right now, all we need to do is to promote them, strengthen their something, give them positive things to do, make them feel a part of society, make them own the processes, that will either affect them or benefit them. And then I think you can try to stop them from being, led into violence undertakings.
Thank you for that powerful answer, Madam President. Elhadj Sy, can you answer your question in a minute and a half?
Thank you. But I really would like to amplify what President Sirleaf just said, right now, in terms of, listening to the youth when they're writing, sit with them, engage with them, and engage, with communities. That is so critical, and we really hope and wish so many leaders will hear that and really put that in practice, instead of having as a first instinct to send the police and then, start beating them up, like we see and then deploy, in many campuses, today, and also in many communities. I think, thank you, Madam President, for really saying that, and we cannot echo that enough. Well, a national response, to a challenge is what we need. Within that, we have two components. There is the government response, which is very important, which is key. And, the leadership, of government is utterly important, but it is not enough. We also need, the society in its different forms of organizations, to be participating, in the same move. And that is at the national level. So a true national response is more than a government response. It has to touch on all those other elements. Globally, it is the same. A true global response is more than just a UN response or an intergovernmental body's response. It also should cut across, the different forms of organization of societies, hence the importance of civil society, organization in all of that. And I think their participation, at all levels, including to address particularly this question, why the civil society is engaging with ECOWAS and also with the national leaders, at the country level, and their voices, be heard, their propositions or proposals be taken into account, like President Johnson-Sirleaf said, their innovations, be promoted, as well as, their ideas, are being fed into decision-making processes are important. Much more important so in times of shocks and crises, because these shocks, like COVID, they really force us all to be humble. We have to be humble because we do not have the power of pulling out a drug out of our pocket and treat people. We don't have the power of pulling out a vaccine and treat people. But we just have to be humble, to listen to each other, to support each other, to find common solutions, and to be ready to adapt and then change where it is needed. And that is only through that kind of a partnership and alliance, that we can go through, this pandemic and prepare for the next one, because unfortunately, this is not the last one. Our biggest fear will be an airborne pathogen, highly pathogen, that will be turned into, a pandemic. And that it is not an utopia. The question is a matter of when, and the key is here to prepare. Thank you.
Thank you, Elhadj Sy, for those very sobering words. As I go through the very last thing on the agenda before we close, I just want to say to the three speakers, could you just think of the one word that you think is the most important thing you want participants, citizens across Africa to take, or the one sentence for your close? So while you're thinking about that, I'll just quickly go through the poll as promised. We took 2 polls during this webinar. The first was, how has your government managed the pandemic emergency measures, such as restrictions on movement? And overwhelmingly, 51% said excessive use was used, and there were many civilian casualties. This is something that we hope the Kofi Annan Foundation, the Jonathan Foundation, and even other donors like OSIWA and other partners will do something about this with their partners. We really need to speak up. We need to make sure that these extrajudicial killings, these civilian casualties end as soon as possible. And do you trust your state authorities in your country to uphold the rule of law during the pandemic? Overwhelmingly, again, 75% said no, which is a very sad indictment and speaks to why democracy is in crisis in Africa and even across the world, that the social contract between the state and citizens has been broken or is breaking, and we really need to do more to rebuild that trust. And I think this conversation today highlighted many small ways in which that can be done, small but impactful ways which we can rebuild that trust. So now, before we close, I also just want to encourage you, if you enjoyed this conversation, please make sure you follow all these organizations on Facebook, on Twitter, on social media, so that you can always stay in touch with them and find out when they're having more interesting dialogues such as these. And so without further ado, I will start in the lineup that we started with, which is with Madam President. Would you please say your last words? And then I'll go over to Mr. Jonathan and then to Elhadj As Sy.
I just want to say thank you to President Jonathan and Mr. Elhadj As Sy through their foundations, which they chair, for putting this together, giving the opportunity for exchange with young people out there who are really the conscience of our society and the future leaders of our countries. And to you, Ayisha, for your moderation skills and all that you've done to keep this whole panel discussion going with a kind of commitment and strength, excitement even, listening to all the questions and responding to them. So thanks to all of you. Just pleased to have been a part of it, and wish all you all stay safe and stay well, and let's all join.
Oh, it looks like we've lost Madam. Oh, just at the right. Oh, okay. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you so much. My concluding statement is that to ensure good governance, all Africans must put in their best to strengthen democracy continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Elhadj As Sy.
Yeah, my thanks to President Johnson-Sirleaf. Thank you, President Goodluck Jonathan. Thank you, Ayisha, and all the participants, who have joined us. And just to say, count on the Kofi Annan Foundation to be on your side for peace, for non-violence, for fairer societies, that are more resilient to withstand shocks like the ones in the middle of which we are today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for your warmth and your sharing your experience so generously with us. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Elhadj As Sy. Thank you to the participants who stuck with us for over an hour and a half. We're really grateful to have you join us. Please stay in touch with the organizers, CAF and Jonathan Foundation. You can find this session on the CAF YouTube channel, and you can also join them on social media. Thank you again, and just stay well and stay safe. Keep washing your hands, keep physically distant, and hopefully this will all blow away soon and we can return to what we hope will be a better normal with stronger democracy in Africa. Thank you so much and goodbye.
Thank you often.
Thank you very much.